Hi everyone, on this video we're going to be making a very basic recipe for Amish white bread. But also within this video we're going to be giving you the 9 steps for making yeast breads and going over some hints that will help you with any recipe for yeast breads that you might come across. So this is the final product that you will end up with as a result of this particular video. So the 9 steps of making yeast bread are something that are pretty ubiquitous across making any yeast bread product. And if you follow these steps when making any product, then you'll be good to go. The first step in making any recipe is going to be scaling or measuring. And these are going to be some things that are hints for measuring in general. The first is going to be to use weights if possible, and then measure everything out before you get started so that you don't forget anything. You want to measure carefully. If you're unsure how, check out our measuring video, and then always use the right tools for measuring as well. So use your liquid measuring cups for liquid, use your dry measuring cups for dry ingredients. And if you follow all of these steps for measuring, then you should be good to go. So the first step is you're going to add 2/3 cup of sugar to the bowl, and we are using standard measurements for this recipe because it's what most people use in the households. But if you are able to purchase a scale for your household, using weights is going to make sure that you get the same consistent results each and every time. After that, you're going to use 2 cups of water, and this should be between 110 and 120 degrees. If you have a thermometer to check that temperature, that's going to be really helpful because you're going to activate the yeast at this temperature, but not kill it. So grabbing a thermometer is going to just make sure you have that insurance policy. You're going to add 1 tablespoon of yeast. I like to purchase this yeast in bulk amounts online or by going to a warehouse store because it's a lot cheaper that way, especially if you make yeast breads a lot. Then you're just going to turn your mixer on with the dough hook and mix a little bit just to mix those things together. And then you're just going to add 1/4 cup of canola or vegetable oil. Then you're going to measure out your 6 cups of flour and let that liquid measurement sit until you see some bubbles. This is going to lead into our next step of your process, and that is going to be mixing. We've done a little bit of mixing in our previous step, but the mixing process overall for yeast spreads is something that hangs a lot of people up, but as long as you follow this basic process, you'll be good. You want to keep your mixer on low until all your flour is in, otherwise you will end up with flour poofing all over your kitchen. You also want to use your dough hook for most breads. That's going to also allow for you to have your kneading happen during this process. You're going to add your flour gradually and then adjust the amount based on what you need because humidity is going to affect your flour amount. And then you're going to add your flour until the dough cleans the bowl and there's no stickiness in the bottom of that bowl. Kneading is included in this step and can be done in the mixer by just letting the dough go in the mixer for a little bit longer after your mixing process is finished. So to start out with any yeast bread process, add about half of your total amount of flour to start out with. So we're going to add 3 cups of flour in this case to the liquid mixer, and then just begin mixing on low, and then we're just going to gradually add the remaining flour. This recipe calls for 6 cups, but you may need less or more because that water grabs humidity out of the air. And so depending on how humid it's been, or honestly if you're using standard measures by measuring by volume, then you might end up having packed the cup a little bit more. But if you look at your bowl, notice how the dough is kind of cleaning the sides of the bowl. That is what you're looking for. You shouldn't have to do a lot of scrubbing of your mixing bowl after mixing a yeast bread. And once it gets to this point, that means that you're good to go. We're not seeing any of that stickiness in the bottom or clinging to the bottom. And then you're going to leave your mixer on for about 5 more minutes to knead. And this process can get a little bit noisy. As you can see, my mixer head is bouncing around a good bit, but it's fine. It can handle it. KitchenAids are workhorses. If it climbs the hook, which happens quite often with yeast breads, you can bump up the speed and that's going to fling it off the sides, or you can stop your mixer and just pull the dough off the hook and kind of push it to the bottom of the bowl and start over again. After this process, you're going to have your third step, which is called benching. It's called benching because you're leaving your dough on the bench, or fermentation, which is basically your first rise. So your hints for benching are that you're going to oil your bowl and dough, or preferably cover your dough with a damp towel. This is going to keep a crust from forming so that you can allow for rise. And then you're going to always let it rise until it's doubled in size. I always take a picture of it. You can also use a rubber band and a clear container to record the size, but the picture just works better for me to see about how much it's gone over that length of time. After it has doubled in size, which generally takes about an hour, you've got your step 4, which is punching down, which sounds like a violent procedure, but it's not. And all you're doing in this particular case, you're going to be gentle with this process. So you're not actually punching down the dough. This process is about redistributing the gas in the dough. You're deflating the dough just a little bit just to let it rise again. So all you're doing is taking the dough out of the bowl and getting the dough kind of back to the size that it was before it went in. And it's going to be a little bit bigger than it was before that rise process started, but it's just kind of making sure that everything's there. So as you can see, we're taking that dough out of the bowl and we're going to plop it down on the board. And to do this punching down process, I usually just use my fingertips and just kind of poke it with my fingertips until all of that stuff is distributed around. So then we're going to get into step 5, which is the makeup process. And makeup means you're making it up into whatever shape it needs to be. You can also call it shaping, depending on what your particular process looks like. I always use a bench scraper to divide the dough. It works really well. It makes clean cuts. It's a little bit easier than a knife, and it just works quickly. Use a scale to keep sizes even if you're making something like yeast rolls. If you're making something like a loaf of bread, you can estimate it a little bit more, but if you're making something like yeast rolls, using a scale to make sure that everything is the exact same size is a good thing. And then don't play with the dough too much. The more you play with the dough, the more the gluten in that dough is going to fight against you. So what you will notice is the more you play with that dough, it's just going to pull back. So if it's pulling back too much and you just can't get it to do what you want it to do, take a break, walk away. The gluten is going to relax over time, and if you just give yourself a little break, go do something else for 20-30 minutes, and the gluten is going to relax a little bit and then come back to it. Because if you are trying to fight a yeast dough, you probably are not going to win. So we're going to cut this dough in half with a bench scraper. And like I said, I generally don't use oil, but in this case, because it's a softer bread, I didn't mind using oil. And then we are going to shape each of these halves into a rectangle. And this does not have to be exact. It does not have to be gorgeous. We're just generally getting it into a rectangle shape. Then you just roll that up into a log. And just tuck those edges in. Then kind of tuck in the sides, and you're going to place it seam side down into a greased loaf pan. And then just repeat the process with your second half. Our next step is proofing, and this is just another rising step, but it's going to be rising in the shape of whatever your final product is going to be. So your hints for this proofing step are: cover your pans with a damp towel, and that's going to keep a crust from forming again, because if a crust forms, it's not going to rise well. If you want to speed your process up a little bit, you can actually place it in an oven, make sure that oven is off, and then place a pan on the bottom and fill that pan with boiling water. And that's going to just give you an environment that makes that yeast super happy, and it's going to rise a little bit better. And then you want to just let this rise until it's about a third bigger than it is now. A warmer room is going to work better for this process than a colder room. So generally you want to have things above 70 degrees. And I will sometimes let things rise next to the stove, just not right next to a burner. So once it's done proofing, we're just going to score it with a razor blade. And this is going to allow it to rise a little bit more. It gives the top crust a little bit of a relief. And this is a process that you'll see a lot. I like to use razor blades because they're just automatically very, very sharp, and it works pretty well for this process. Just make sure it's a razor blade that you haven't used for anything else. It needs to be a brand new one. After that, you're going to bake your bread. And this is where your kitchen is going to just start smelling amazing. So, your hints for baking. So you want to start, if any recipe says that you're going to be baking it for a range of times, start with the lowest time listed when you're setting your timer. You can always add time on, but you can't take time off. With your internal temperature, that's the best way to measure yeast spreads because that's going to ensure that you're not over or undercooked. A temperature of 200 means that you haven't evaporated all the water out. If you're above 200, that means you've gotten really close to that boiling point, which means you've gotten all the water out of that dough. So an internal temperature of 200 ensures that you haven't gotten that dough too dry. You want to bake towards the center of your oven and use convection if possible. That means that a fan is running in there, and that's going to keep your heat a lot more even in your oven, which means you're not going to have hot spots. Most of the rise happens in your proofing step, but the rest of it is going to happen in the oven, and this is called oven spring. So keep in mind you will get a little bit more rise in that oven step. So this is just a satisfying time lapse of bread rising, because who doesn't love a time lapse? So you want to check the internal temperature for doneness once it's done baking, and like I said before, you want it to be about 200 degrees so that all of the water has not evaporated out of the bread. So step 8 is going to be cooling, and cooling is very, very important for bread because all of the starches are going to come together. So we do have some hints for cooling. To start out with, you're going to cool in your pans on a cooling rack for about 30 minutes, and by putting them on the cooling rack, it just allows air to circulate underneath it and all around. And then after you have cooled it on the cooling rack in the pans, you're going to cool it out of the pans on the cooling rack until it is completely and totally cool. And you want to make sure that it's completely cooled off before you start to cut it, because if you cut it before it's cooled, then the bread is just going to kind of collapse and mush down when you try to cut into it. So as you can tell, we've got our absolutely gorgeous loaves here, all baked and ready to go. You want to cut your bread with a serrated knife and not a regular chef's knife. And a serrated knife is just the one that has the wavy blade on it. And we have a demonstration here as to why you should do that. So as you can see, when we cut into the bread with a serrated knife and you use that sawing motion to go through, it goes to the bread very, very easily. And we've got the pretty slice with the nice cross section. But if you were to use a regular chef's knife with the straight blade, it just mushes the bread down as you go into it. And even if you were to saw a little bit, it doesn't really go through there. So that's the reason that you use a serrated knife and not a regular chef's knife. So our last step is storage, and this is really important for bread because bread will dry out very easily if it's left out and it's not protected from the elements. So our hints for storing are very, very important. The first step for storage is going to be to wait until it is completely cool before you decide to put it into any sort of storage location. If you do not wait until it is completely cool, it's going to condense in whatever bag or whatever you put it into. You want to store it in airtight bags usually, that's the best place to put it. But as I mentioned in the earlier step, if it is warm when you put it in there, then you're going to have condensation in the bag, which is going to lead to the bread molding a lot quicker. You want to wait to cut it until just before serving because it's going to dry out a little bit easier than regular store-bought bread because it doesn't have any preservatives in it. This doesn't last as long as that because regular store-bought bread has tons of things added into it to make it last a lot longer. And with that being said, fresh baked bread is not going to last as long as purchased bread. You want to use it or freeze it within 3 to 4 days for your best results, just to make sure that you are able to enjoy it for as long as possible. Yeast bread is something that a lot of people don't really feel comfortable trying because they feel like it's a difficult process and like they don't have the skills to do it. But if you have some hints and you have some basics, it is definitely something that anybody can tackle. I hope this video has given you the skills that you need in order to try making your own bread because it's definitely something that's worth trying. Thank you so much for joining us today on Mixing with Merks. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.